Welcome to the New Statesman podcast. I'm Rachel Cunliffe, and this is an episode we like to call You Ask Us. I'm joined in the studio by the New Statesman's political correspondent, Freddie Hayward, and down the line by our senior data journalist, Ben Walker. My question is nice and punchy. A listener called Nick asks, what is the party whip system and how the hell can it be democratic? Freddie, you want to take this one. What is the whip system?
So the whip system is how parties ensure that MPs in Parliament vote for what they want them to vote on. So it's how the government ensures that legislation gets through. It's how the opposition ensures that it votes against the government. So the whips are those in the party who tell MPs vote this way. And you have different gradations of whips. So a one-line whip is less important than a three-line whip. You have to turn up for a three-line whip. Because it's either a confidence issue or a really important bill. So that's how they do it. Is it a good thing? I controversially believe it is. I think this question has in part perhaps come up because Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, the mayors of Manchester and Liverpool, have both criticised the whip system for being anti-democratic because it forces MPs to vote in ways in which they might not like to because they've been instructed by the party.
The problem with Westminster is it can make a fraud out of good people. You're being asked to vote in certain ways that you may not fully believe and say things that, don't represent your views with lines to take. That isn't, in the end, a system that supports people to be good politicians, in my view. It almost does the opposite. It kind of makes them appear like something they're not. And that, I think, is the problem. The system doesn't allow people to be the people that they went in there wanting to be. Because everyone goes in there wanting to change the world, and you kind of discover that you can't really because of the way it's set up. So we think removing the whip system, reforming Parliament, would actually empower the status of our elected representatives and our MPs, and would be good for them as well.
But I think the key thing to remember is that the whip system enables the government and the opposition to vote on things and to pass laws which they've been elected to pass. So the key thing is that a party will go to the electorate at an election and say, this is our manifesto, this is what we want to do. And the only way in which they can pass that manifesto, make it into law, is if they have that majority in the House of Commons. And the only way in which they have a majority in the House of Commons is if they whip their MPs and make sure they vote for it.
Yeah, I think the democratic question is really interesting because it comes down to, when you vote for an MP, are you voting for that particular individual or are you voting for the party they represent? And I think for most people it's a combination of both, and they will weight those two things differently. But obviously a party's manifesto really matters. If it didn't matter, they wouldn't bother to write them. And MPs are sent to Parliament as part of a party to help enact the platform that party put forward in its manifesto in the election. So there is a case for that's your role in Parliament. You need to vote with the government on it, even if you don't agree with every aspect of it. I think it becomes a bit trickier when there are issues that come up and votes that come up that were nothing to do with the manifesto, and particularly ones that come up that are tied to current events in ways that were unforeseen. And obviously the two main parties are really broad churches and have a wide range of views within them, and it does cause trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? Because the whipping system is integral to everything. So if you try and change that, I think the whole system sort of breaks down. It's the way in which the House of Commons can override the House of Lords. It's central to elections and what parties promise. It's essential to the government even being able to function. The reason that the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister is because they can command a majority in the House. So it's related to everything. And I think you have to look at the alternative. If you do get rid of it, what would it look like? You'd have sort of 650 independent
cats. You'd be herding cats.
And that's not a good way, and not a good system for government. I think you have to look to America, where you've got a very different system with senators who have much more independence, and they will vote on issues that their party haven't told them to. And you get this gridlock. You get them voting down the White House, and I don't think that's how the British system works. So there are risks in getting rid of it.
I mean, I do like the idea of introducing 650 cats into Parliament. Maybe it would deal with the mice problem. But it is informal as well, in that like there is, it is for the parties to decide what they're going to whip on, and MPs who defy the whip can be suspended from the party, but they'll still be MPs, as we've seen. So it's another one of these things where Westminster is built on convention and historical practices. Ben, you have some direct experience of being whipped. Do you want to talk about that?
Thanks for that wording. That's absolutely very PG for the new Statesman. For those who don't know, I'm a humble borough councillor myself, and though a borough councillor is just that, it's nothing entirely hugely important. It is nevertheless, you are part of a group of people. You are helping run, playing the elected part in running a borough council. You've got £1 billion budget and such like. And so when I was elected on the understanding that I would be implementing the manifesto of that which I was elected on. And I would expect, and I think every member, council, parliament or elsewhere elected would at least adhere to that. But it's when it becomes a bit more prescriptive, when it goes from broad brushstroke manifesto promises to very specific detail that sometimes you're voting on going forward or going against. So, for example, putting a contract out to tender, should it be put out to tender or should you hire in-house? Small things like that can end up being whipped, and it goes from you in your head think, well, people weren't voting for me based on this. At least I can take some sort of initiative here, and then the whips sort of shuffle up to you and say, "Oh, actually, no, you've got to do it this way," and it does irk you somewhat. Nevertheless, where would we be? Where we wouldn't have House of Cards if we didn't have a whip system. So think of the cultural losses. But something to consider is this: what proportion of Britons really think about the personal versus the political? What proportion of Britons are voting for the party over the personality? And to be honest with you, it is almost always going to be the party. No one, I think, in a battleground seat, however much they convince themselves, is truly convincing themselves into thinking that it was I that won it. When you see some pretty in so-called red wall seats, those voters weren't exactly voting for the local candidate; they were voting for Boris Johnson's "Get Brexit Done." I really think that's a primary thing there. And if you look at local council elections, or others, you can actually work out what proportion of your vote is actually personal, what proportion of the vote is coming to you, the person, where you can take the initiative for your local residents. And here in Chester, we had a candidate who, she outperformed where she was modelled to be, and it was a 2-member seat. So she was, there were 2 candidates of the same party. She outperformed her secondary candidate by about, I think it was like 300, 400, 500 votes. And in a low turnout by-election, that was like a 10% difference, right? So in that single case, you can say a personal vote can amount to as much as 10%. As a share of your own party vote, that's small. That's like a quarter, maybe less than that, maybe actually 10% of that. So really, I think members across all branches, across all governments should at least realise that people are voting for the party, not them.
But this is an interesting point that you touch on there, Ben. It's about the demoralisation of MPs and people who have to be whipped. I think many MPs in Parliament resent the fact sometimes that they have to vote for things that they don't necessarily agree with, particularly over the past few years. And I think, as you said, Rachel, because it's informal, you often get quite a lot of pressure applied through patronage, through threats. We don't really know, but the stories that you hear from the whip's office are not how we would expect MPs to always act. So because of that informality, you do have this other side where you've got sort of 650 people, or those outside the government who don't enjoy the job of being an MP as much as they would, because they feel as if they're not acting on their own initiative or living out that ideal of making up their own minds and governing for their constituents. So that's the other aspect to it as well.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.